the summer of 1991, a group of seasoned sailors set out on their routine voyage across the vast expanse of the ocean. Their ship cut through the calm waters, the horizon stretching endlessly before them. For the crew, the days blended into one another as they moved between shifts, routine tasks, and casual conversations. But that day was unlike any other. It was around midday when the sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the deck, that something unusual caught the attention of one of the sailors on lookout. A small lone object was drifting in the water, far from any known landmass. At first, it seemed like debris, an everyday sight in the middle of the sea. But as the ship grew closer, the object began to take shape. It was a small boat, battered and worn by the merciless sea, but that was not what struck the crew with fear and uncertainty. No, it was the figure sitting motionless on the boat. The lookout's voice rang out, trembling with disbelief. "There's something out there," he shouted. "It's a child." The sailor's words were met with confusion. A child, alone at sea. As the ship drew closer, the sailors could see more clearly. A little black boy, not older than 4 or 5, sat in the middle of the tiny boat. His eyes were wide with fear, his body shivering from both the cold water around him and the uncertainty of what had brought him here. He was completely alone. His boat, a small inflatable raft, bobbed gently on the surface of the water, too fragile for the weight of such a child. The sight was surreal, almost impossible to believe. It was as if this boy had appeared out of nowhere, pulled from the very depths of the ocean itself. The sailors quickly moved into action. The ship's engine roared to life, and the crew rushed to prepare a small rescue boat. The closer they came, the clearer the boy's distress became. His face was gaunt, his skin sunken and pale, a stark contrast to his usual youthful vibrance. His clothes were tattered, and there were signs of deep dehydration and exhaustion etched onto his young face. There was no sign of anyone else on the raft, just this lone child, abandoned in the middle of the sea, a child who should never have been there in the first place. The sailors exchanged worried glances. How could this happen? Who would abandon a child in such a dangerous, unforgiving place? Had he been lost at sea for days, or had he just recently found himself stranded? The questions piled up in their minds, but none of them had the answers. There was only the boy, drifting aimlessly, waiting to be rescued from a nightmare no child should ever face. As the small boat reached the raft, the sailors surrounded the boy carefully, trying to avoid startling him further. His eyes were wide with both fear and disbelief. He looked up at them, but it was as if he wasn't sure whether to trust them or not. His gaze shifted between the sailors, who were now lowering their hands toward him, trying to offer him a lifeline. His tiny body trembled as he clung to the side of the raft, not daring to move. One of the sailors, a seasoned rescuer, slowly reached forward and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's okay, little one. You're safe now," he said in the softest voice possible, trying to calm the child. The boy's response was not what the sailor had expected. Instead of relaxing, the boy looked up with a frightened expression, and for a brief moment, the sailor thought he might pull away. But then the boy's lips parted, and a quiet, trembling voice emerged, barely above a whisper. "I don't want to go back," he said, almost as if he feared the very rescue he was being offered. The sailor froze. His heart skipped a beat. What did the boy mean? Why would a child not want to leave the sea and return to safety? The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. The child's eyes darted nervously toward the horizon, as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the ocean at any moment. But no one could answer the boy's words. No one understood why he seemed so fearful of leaving the ocean behind, or what horrors he had encountered in his short life. The sailors exchanged glances, their faces etched with worry. What had happened to this child? How long had he been stranded? And what was the secret that he seemed to carry with him, one that made him fear the safety they were trying to offer? As the boy was carefully lifted from the raft and into the safety of the rescue boat, the crew was left with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain: this was not just any ordinary rescue. This was the beginning of a story that would shake them to their core. A story of survival, of courage, and of a child whose journey had brought him face to face with the darkest depths of the ocean, and possibly something even more terrifying. As they began to head back toward the ship, the sailors knew that their lives had been changed forever. Whatever had brought this boy to the sea was something far beyond their understanding. But they would soon learn that the boy's story, and the secrets he held, would change their lives in ways they could never have imagined. The rescue was only the beginning. The boy sat quietly in the rescue boat, his small hands gripping the sides as if afraid the sea might reach out and pull him back. His body was trembling, either from the cold or from the deep, lingering fear that seemed to cling to him like the salty air. The sailors had wrapped him in a thick blanket, but the warmth of the cloth couldn't mask the fear in his eyes. He wasn't just a child lost at sea. He was a survivor, a child who had endured something unimaginable. The journey back to the ship was slow, and the crew could not help but glance at the boy, unsure of what to say. His silence was heavy, and no one wanted to disturb him, afraid that speaking might bring the memories flooding back. What could they possibly say to a child who had faced the immense loneliness of the ocean, clinging to life as his only hope? It was only when the ship's captain, a kind-hearted man who had seen much in his years of service, sat beside the boy that the silence was broken. "What's your name, little one?" he asked softly, his voice calm and gentle, like a lullaby. The boy looked up at him, his eyes dark but filled with a trace of curiosity. I don't know," he murmured, his voice so soft it was barely audible. The captain's heart sank. The child didn't even remember his name. He didn't know where he came from or who he was. The realization hit the crew like a heavy weight. This boy had been alone for so long, and whatever had happened to him, it had erased all the simple parts of his life. His name, his family, his past. The captain paused, letting the boy's words sink in. He didn't want to push the child too hard, but they needed to know what had happened. "Where are you from?" he asked, his tone still kind, hoping the boy would remember something. Anything. The boy's lips trembled, and for a moment, the sailors thought he wouldn't answer. Then, with a deep sigh, the boy spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I was with my family," he said, his eyes growing distant as he relived the memory. "We were sailing. Then, there was a storm." The sailors exchanged glances. A storm. It all began to make sense. They had heard stories of such tragedies, storms that sank ships, storms that took people without a trace. But to hear it from the boy's lips made it all too real. The boy continued, though his words came slower now, as if trying to piece together the fragments of the terrifying event. "The boat flipped over," he said, his small hands trembling as he spoke. "I tried to hold on, but the water was so strong. The waves, they were so big." His voice quivered as if the memory was still too fresh, too painful to bear. "Then I was alone. I couldn't find anyone. I floated for days, on a piece of the boat. But the sea, it never stopped. It kept going." The captain and the sailors were stunned. The boy had been lost in the middle of the ocean, drifting alone for days. No one could fathom the fear and isolation he must have felt. It wasn't just the physical hardship of hunger and thirst. It was the mental battle, a battle against the emptiness, the loneliness, and the constant, overwhelming fear of not knowing if rescue would ever come. The boy's survival was nothing short of miraculous. The sailors had heard of many who perished at sea, but this boy, against all odds, had clung to life. They had no idea how, but somehow he had managed to survive the waves, the scorching sun, and the cold nights. The human spirit, it seemed, had found a way to keep him going. After hearing the boy's story, the crew could not help but feel a sense of awe. They knew that survival in such conditions was almost impossible, The boy had somehow found the will to live, even when everything seemed lost. It was the kind of strength they had only heard of in the tales of the most heroic men, yet here it was, embodied in a small child. But the story wasn't over. As the days passed, the boy began to recover. He drank water, ate small meals, and rested in the safety of the ship. His body began to regain its strength, but his mind remained fragile, haunted by the memories of the storm and the weeks he had spent alone. Despite everything, he was quiet and withdrawn. The sailors had expected him to be overjoyed at his rescue, but the boy's demeanor told a different story. It was as if the trauma of his experience had shut him off from the world. He didn't laugh, he didn't play, and he didn't speak much, except when asked about his journey. And when he did speak, it was always in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that only he understood. One evening, as the boy sat on deck, watching the sun set over the ocean, the captain joined him again. He sat beside him in silence, letting the boy come to him in his own time. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of understanding. The boy wasn't ready to talk, and the captain knew that. So they just sat together, watching the colors of the sunset stretch across the sky. It wasn't until much later, as the boy grew stronger, that he finally started to open up. Slowly, like the ebbing of the tide, the walls he had built around himself began to soften. He would ask questions about the ship, about the sailors, about the world outside the ocean. And in time, the boy began to laugh, his small voice breaking through the silence that had enveloped him for so long. The sailors had saved a life, but the boy had given them something in return, a reminder of the incredible power of the human spirit. A reminder that even in the most hopeless of situations, survival is possible. It was a story of strength, of endurance, and of the unbreakable will to live, and it was only just beginning. As the days passed and the boy's health slowly improved, something remarkable began to unfold among the sailors. What started as a routine rescue mission had now become an emotional journey that they would never forget. The boy's story, the pain in his eyes, and the hardships he had endured at sea deeply affected each and every one of them. No one could remain indifferent to his suffering. They had all seen their fair share of tragedy during their years on the ocean, but this was different. This wasn't just a story of survival. It was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, and it moved them in ways they couldn't explain. It wasn't just the captain who felt this emotional pull. It was every sailor on board. The crew, made up of tough, seasoned men who had faced storms, battles, and even the occasional shipwreck, found themselves weeping for the young boy. They didn't cry because they were sad about the boy's fate. They cried because, in him, they saw the triumph of the human will. In his young, fragile body, they saw what it meant to fight against the odds, to survive against everything the ocean had thrown at him. The sailor who had first spotted the boy on the horizon, through the ship's binoculars, stood by the railing one evening, staring out at the sea. He was the one who had seen the small raft bobbing helplessly in the distance. He had been the one to raise the alarm, and he had led the charge to rescue the child. At first, he had been uncertain whether the boy would even survive, uncertain whether they would be able to help him. But now, as he looked at the boy, recovering and playing on the deck, the sailor couldn't hold back his tears. He thought back to the image of the boy's fragile face staring up at him, desperate for help, the confusion and fear in his eyes. He wasn't the only one affected. The ship's cook, a burly man with hands that had spent decades preparing meals for the crew, was found alone in the galley, wiping his eyes. The boy had reminded him of his own children. He couldn't shake the image of the boy, alone at sea, struggling to stay afloat. He had a daughter at home, and he couldn't help but imagine her in the same position. The thought was unbearable. The cook had spent days preparing the boy's meals, carefully making sure they were full of nutrients, trying to help him regain his strength. Every time the boy finished a meal, the cook would smile, proud of the small victory. But it wasn't just about the food. It was about the connection he felt to the boy. He felt protective of him, like he was his own child, and he made it his mission to ensure that the boy would never feel hunger or loneliness again. He would often sit with the boy, talking to him, telling him stories from his childhood, trying to make the boy feel like he was part of their family. Then there was the first mate, a gruff man who had spent most of his life at sea. He had never been one for sentimentality, but something about this boy's ordeal struck a chord deep within him. He would often catch himself thinking about the boy during his shifts, his mind wandering to what it must have been like to drift alone on the ocean, with nothing but the sound of the waves to keep him company. The first mate had seen death on the seas. He had witnessed men lost in the storm, ships swallowed by the waves. But he had never seen anything like this. The boy, despite everything, still had hope in his eyes. That hope, that spark of life, was something that filled him with awe. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sailors gathered on the deck to watch the sky change colors, their faces somber. The boy was sitting with them, his small frame barely visible against the large, weathered wood of the ship. He was drawing in the sand with a stick, a small smile playing on his lips as he traced shapes in the dust. The sailors watched him in silence, their hearts heavy but filled with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This little boy, whose name they didn't even know, had come into their lives like a whirlwind. He had opened something in each of them that they hadn't known was there, a deep emotional well that they hadn't known they had. The captain, who had been the boy's closest companion throughout the rescue, stood beside the railing, his eyes fixed on the boy. The boy had come to him for comfort in the days following the rescue, asking questions about the ship, about the world, and about his family. The captain had done his best to answer, though he knew that some of the boy's questions would never be answered. Yet it was through these conversations that they had forged a bond. And as the boy began to heal, that bond grew stronger. The captain turned to the crew, his voice low but filled with emotion. "We've all been through a lot. And this boy, this little one, has shown us something we'll never forget. He's shown us what it means to survive. He's shown us what it means to keep going when the odds are stacked against you. And now, he's not just a child we rescued. He's part of our crew. He's part of our family." The sailors nodded, their faces reflecting the deep emotion they all felt. They had been through rough seas, but nothing had been as tough as the emotional journey they had shared with the boy. He had become more than a survivor. He had become a symbol of hope, of resilience, and of the unspoken bond that tied them all together as human beings. As the sun set behind them, the crew stood in silence, their hearts connected by an experience none of them would ever forget. They had saved a life, but in doing so, they had learned something invaluable, that even in the most difficult of times, there is always room for hope and always room for compassion. The boy's story, his survival, had left an indelible mark on each of them, and they knew they would carry it with them for the rest of their lives. As the days turned into weeks, the once fragile and frightened boy began to transform before the crew's eyes. What had started as a desperate rescue mission had slowly evolved into something even more profound, a story of rebirth, of a new beginning. The boy, who had been stranded alone in the vast, unforgiving ocean, now found himself surrounded by a crew that cared for him, offering him warmth, security, and most importantly, hope. The sailors had not only rescued a child from the depths of the sea, they had brought him back to life in ways far deeper than the physical. The ship had become his sanctuary, a place where he was no longer just a survivor of the ocean's cruelty, but a young boy with a future. The sailors, though tough and seasoned by years at sea, began to treat him as one of their own. The boy's healing process was slow, but the constant care from the crew and the gentle encouragement from the captain helped him begin to regain the sense of normalcy he had lost. He started to smile more, to play with the sailors' children who would visit the ship, and to ask more questions about the world beyond the sea. One morning, after a particularly calm night on the waters, the boy was sitting on deck, staring out at the horizon, his legs dangling over the side. The sailors had noticed this new habit of his, gazing out toward the endless ocean as if he was searching for something. At first, they had thought it was just a lingering effect of his time stranded at sea, but now they understood it was more. He was no longer searching for survival. He was searching for answers, for his place in the world. The captain approached him, sitting down beside the boy. For a while, they sat in silence, the vastness of the ocean stretching out before them. Finally, the boy spoke, his voice soft but determined. "Do you think I'll ever see my family again?" he asked, his words hanging in the air. The captain looked at the boy, a lump forming in his throat. He had heard the boy's fragmented story over the past few days, and he knew that the boy's family was lost, either drowned in the storm or swept away by the relentless waves. But to say that would crush the child's spirit. Instead, he put his arm around the boy's small shoulders and replied with a warmth he hadn't expected to feel. "We're going to find your family," the captain said firmly. "I know it's hard, but we'll make sure you have a family again. You're not alone anymore." It wasn't a promise that the captain could guarantee, but it was a promise to never stop trying. And for the boy, that was enough. The comfort in the captain's words, the certainty in his voice, was the last piece of reassurance he needed. He had been alone for so long that the mere thought of belonging to someone again, of being part of something greater than himself, gave him hope. The boy no longer saw himself as a victim of the sea. He saw himself as a child with a future, with a chance to live a life filled with love and joy. Soon after, a new mission was set in motion. The crew began their search, using the coordinates of where they had found the boy to trace the shipwreck's path. With the help of nearby coastal authorities, they reached out to other ships, looking for any signs of a family lost at sea. But weeks passed, and though their efforts were tireless, no one had come forward to claim the boy. At this point, it was clear to everyone on board that the boy had become a part of their crew, a part of their family. There was no longer a need to search for the people who had left him stranded, because the crew had become the family he had lost. The sailors treated him like their own child, protecting him, laughing with him, and teaching him everything they could about the world. As the ship docked in a port one day, the boy, now strong and healthy, stood on the deck, watching the bustling life of the port city. It was his first time seeing so many people after being lost at sea, and while it was overwhelming, he felt a sense of peace. The world was so much larger than the ocean, but it was full of possibilities. The captain stood beside him, looking out over the city. He turned to the boy and smiled. "You've come a long way, little one. This is your new beginning." For the first time in what felt like forever, the boy smiled back, a wide, bright smile that radiated innocence and joy. He had finally found his place. It wasn't the place he had imagined, or the life he had planned for himself, but it was his new beginning. A new chance to live, to love, and to grow. The crew made arrangements for the boy to stay with a family in the port town. They would watch over him, ensuring he was given every opportunity to thrive in this new life. The boy would attend school, play with other children, and learn all the things a child should. Though the boy would never forget the time he spent alone at sea, he would now have the chance to build a future filled with love, laughter, and family. The sailors, too, returned to their own lives, but they would always carry the boy's story with them. They had saved him, but he had also saved them. Through his resilience, his spirit, and his innocence, the boy had shown them the true meaning of survival. He had reminded them of what truly mattered: the ability to hope, to find strength in the darkest moments, and to never give up. As the ship sailed away from the port, the crew looked back at the boy, now standing with his new family, a smile on his face. They knew that his journey was far from over, but they were content knowing they had been a part of his new beginning. It was a miracle that began with the ocean and ended with a life full of promise, a life that had been saved by the kindness and love of strangers. In the end, the boy had found a family, and the sailors had found their hearts a little fuller. They had witnessed a miracle, and they would never forget it.